Well, well, well. Welcome to another exit strategy. I am your host, Be Good, and I am joined by, as he used to say, my trusty sidekick, Jay Witt, who has been launched out to plant his own non-church over on his channel. But we decided that we would get back together again. So the nights shall ride again. Um, yeah, we
Hmm.
decided we get together for this episode, which was I don't even know how to set it up, but before I even get to setting it up, um, might as well give a nice little throwback to last week's episode where we did on Jay Witt's channel, where we looked at Pastor Eric Mason finding Satan in the Old Testament. So, Jay Witt, I don't know if you have any comments you want to read from that episode. Meanwhile, as people come in, welcome to the channel. Welcome to tonight's show. Come on into the live chat. Greet somebody in reason's name. We're glad you're here, whether you are a fellow skeptic, fellow former believer, or if you're a current believer. Guess what? You're welcome. Jay Witt, you had a line you used to say to that end. How did your line go?
Yep, yep. We're getting those things which are behind us. We reach for things ahead. We're changing it up. We're changing it up on them. We're coming into
Okay.
a new year pretty
Okay.
soon, right? And by the time
Indeed.
you guys hear this, we will be in a new year.
Yeah, so
Um, so it's time for new things.
okay.
But
Well, but it's still true.
uh,
It's still we're not your
mhm.
enemies. We're your friends.
We're,
So
we're, we're not your, we're your friends. Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes. We're
that
your
might be the only
friends.
time we hear that in 2025. I hope not. But
Yeah.
so yeah, welcome to tonight's episode. I've been looking forward to this episode even when I didn't know. I had no idea that this episode was coming, but something within me was looking forward to this episode. In fact, I wrote an entire book because this episode didn't exist. And my book was an attempt to flesh out this conversation between two, I can't say two giants because Peter Enns is not really a giant in the Christian space, though William Lane Craig is. But Peter Enns has a
Hmm.
significant role in my deconversion because I think it was 2013 or so, might have even been 2012 that I read his book, The Evolution of Adam. And in reading it, I did not agree with his conclusion, but he made me start asking tougher questions about Genesis. Peter Enns was motivated by evolution and particularly population genetics to deny the reality of an historical Adam and Eve. And so he said Paul had to have been wrong in Romans 5, yet Peter Enns did not see himself as leaving the Christian faith, denying Jesus, or the Bible, so much as he said we now have to understand the Bible differently. So still a Christian, still an evangelical, depending on what your scorecard, what you have on your evangelical bingo scorecard. But he considers himself still an evangelical, taught at an evangelical school. I think maybe even still teaches there. But it does not hold traditional views of Adam and Eve. Um,
Okay. Can I
yeah, yeah,
can I interject here to read a little from the wiki page on Peter Enns, just so
sure.
people have a better, maybe even a more kind of a larger view of who he is in
Mm,
evangelicalism. Peter Enns, so he publishes this book called Inspiration and Incarnation, which
mm,
leads to a huge controversy, which is going to be elucidated here. The general content of inspiration and incarnation was taught by Enns over his 14-year teaching career at Westminster Theological Seminary. So that's to say he had been teaching this stuff for a decade, almost and a half, right?
mm.
It was only after the book's publication, that is, in 2005, that a lengthy controversy ensued. The main point of contention was whether the book was within the theological boundaries of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Westminster faculty members take an oath that their teaching will be in line with that confession. That's the Westminster Confession of Faith, right? On March 26, 2008, the Board of Trustees at Westminster Theological Seminary voted 18 to 9 to suspend Enns from his position effective May 23rd, 2008. Though the faculty voted 12 to 8 that the work falls within the parameters of the Westminster Confession of Faith, the chairman of the board said that a majority of the members on the board at that time felt the book was incompatible with the confession. As of August 1st, 2008, Enns and the seminary agreed to part ways. Following the board's vote, 9 trustees resigned from the board. That's it. Sorry for that little brief interruption, Brady, but hopefully that's helpful to some folks so they understand. At Westminster, maybe you could tell them a little about Westminster, seeing that you're
Well, yeah,
a Westminster grad.
I don't want anybody to get confused because, like I said, the book that he wrote that started my journey out of the faith was a book called The Evolution of Adam. The book that caused the controversy at the school was a book, like you said, called Inspiration and Incarnation, or Incarnation and Inspiration.
Yep.
That book had nothing to do with Adam, evolution, or anything. There was a controversy. We talked about this very briefly on this podcast before, where Enns, I think, was operating according to a Christotelic hermeneutic that sees everything in the Old Testament pointing toward Jesus, as opposed to the school and the confession wanted more of a Christocentric hermeneutic. So not things are pointing toward Jesus. No, these things are actually about Jesus, even in the Old Testament. Everything is centered around Jesus Christ, even in the Old Testament. So that's what led to the big hoopla at the school. And like you said, some of the trustees resigned after the school let him go because they said, well, we voted that he was within the bounds of the confession. Why are we firing him? And the schools continue to go through those kinds of changes where faculty are upset with the way the organization is deciding against its former professors. So it's still going on to this day, where there's this huge turnover with different professors and all that. But
are you suggesting that the contents of the book that you had trouble with, they would have found to fall within the parameters of the Westminster Confession?
I don't know, but it's very shocking that wasn't. Matter of fact, let's see when he wrote The Evolution of Adam, because that will actually play into this whole idea. Because I read it in 2012, maybe.
Some 4 years after he was already suspended.
So yeah, he wrote that in 2012. Oh, I read it around the same time that he wrote it. So yeah, he wasn't at the school when he wrote that, so the school could have no say on it. I would imagine that had he been at the school while he wrote that, he wouldn't have written that book. I think the Christotelic hermeneutic thing he felt was safe. The Evolution of Adam was not a safe thing to write if you're going to be teaching at Westminster.
Okay. So that's an important distinction.
Yep,
so
for sure.
By the time that was 4 years after he was let go from Westminster, by the time he wrote or by the time he published that book.
Yeah.
And he was free to do that at that point.
Yep. And there's another professor.
So you have
Well, I was going to say there's another professor there who, when I wrote a paper dismantling his book, The Evolution of Adam, one, because I didn't think evolution was true, and two, because how are you going to try to say, yeah, but there's still a such thing as sin and death, even without an Adam, so we still need Jesus. I couldn't see how he was making that connection. And when I told my Hebrew language professor about it, rather than pat me on the back like, good job, he told me like, no, Peter Enns is a good guy and he's still a good friend of mine. And these are the books that influenced him to think the way he thinks about evolution and Adam. If you get a chance, you should check him out. And that was over lunch. So I just, I didn't think too much about it. But later on that night, I said, yo, you're not supposed to be telling me to read the books that influence Enns to think that way. But the fact that you didn't tell me Enns was wrong, and you told me to read the books that influenced him, made me say, wait, so are you, without saying it, because you don't want to get fired, are you saying that Enns has a point? And that's what made me start saying, I got some thinking to do. And as that was 2012, 2013, 2014, I was sitting in a class and somehow it all just came together that what I was struggling with in that class, I traced it back to that's probably why Enns was able to say what he said. And at that moment, I just felt something within me say, oh shit. Like,
It's like a eureka moment.
like when
Yeah.
JR in the JR interview, JR said, somebody making this shit up. Like I had one of those
Yeah.
moments where
Yeah.
I got it. And I said, oh my, and like I tried to bury it, but I knew. I think somewhere within me,
Hmm.
I knew this is the beginning of the end. And I never read
Hmm.
another Peter Enns book until we read the one that we did on the podcast about a year or so ago.
Hmm.
So I went 12
The sin of
years.
certainty.
I went 12 years without reading, well, maybe 11 years without reading anything else from Peter Enns. But it started me thinking. So this is a long way to get to this point. Peter Enns was the beginning. He was on this end of the bookshelf. There's another book end over here. Once I got to the point where I said, okay, now I need to dig in and study this stuff. 6 years had passed from my foundation cracking in 2014 to me saying, now I need to study this so that I can articulate why I don't believe this. Well, in that year, 2021, when I was doing my research, I came across William Lane Craig. And William Lane Craig, he also had something like a crisis of faith where, oh, wait, so if Adam and Eve are not historical,
No, we got to pause there for a
yeah,
little because to say William Lane Craig, one of the chief apologists internationally right now, had a
yep.
crisis of faith, or is this hyperbole, or are you saying he himself
No,
would
no.
admit to
So
that or use that kind of phrasing?
I'm going to put the segment of William Lane Craig explaining why it was so catastrophic to him and how he struggled.
The view that I've come to is the end of a long, long struggle. From the beginning point, there's a lot at stake. What's at stake is the infallibility and inerrancy of the New Testament.
We
And
knew this 2 years ago, though, Bill.
well,
Didn't you realize 2 years ago that it was going to work out?
well, I suppose I had a sort of rough idea, but no, I've really struggled with this and wrestled with this.
I probably
I
need to be
think
more
that
empathetic here. That's my problem.
the most difficult part of this whole question is not the Old Testament material, it's the New Testament material. And I still haven't gotten to my main point, and that is it's the statements of Jesus himself about Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, and this primeval history where Jesus seems, to all appearances, to believe in the historicity of these events. So if you say that, well, these are not historical persons and not historical events, that means that Jesus held false beliefs. And that is incompatible with his omniscience, because to be omniscient is to believe all truths and to hold no false beliefs. And that is incompatible with his deity. So as crazy as it sounds, I think what's at stake is the deity of Christ.
This messes with the doctrine of inerrancy. It also messes with the doctrine of Christ. Like if Jesus is God, but he held false views, he can't be God. And so he struggled, but he worked his way through it, which he'll talk about in this interview. Anyway, what it did for me was with Peter Enns on this end of the bookshelf, starting my deconversion, William Lane Craig, as I was doing my research, here you have one of the chief apologists of the Christian faith struggling with the same thing. But then when I read William Lane Craig's book, because he wrote a book on how he reconciles his belief in Adam and Eve with the science, and the way he reconciled it was so unconvincing to me. And he showed his hand so much where he says, we can accept as much of the science as the Bible will allow. And then he went on this journey to stretch the Bible to make it allow the things he's going to talk about in this video, where the Bible doesn't really allow it, but he's going to stretch it to make it. Because his premise is as long as there's no doctrine against the teaching that science is finding, everything's fine. If there's a biblical doctrine against that teaching, I
Yeah.
can't accept that teaching unless I can find a way to stretch the Bible around it. And that's what his whole book is about.
Mm.
So to have Peter Enns and William Lane Craig having this conversation, I wrote my book to try to make them have a conversation so that people can see
Mhm.
Enns is right about Paul being wrong about Adam and Eve, but Craig is wrong about how he's trying to reconcile these two. Like Peter Enns is not going to agree with this attempt to reconcile. Like it's either, I don't want to spoil it, but you can't say it's myth and then still try to say it's history. Something's got to give. And William Lane Craig is going to try to argue that it's both. It's myth and history. And that's where they're going to clash. So they'll clash here, but they'll clash in one of the most congenial ways you'll ever see anybody clash. So they won't even debate. They're going to discuss. And even the discussion is not even going to get to the white meat.
You do realize the clash is there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not focused on.
Yeah.
It's a little deceptive the way Craig, I walked away from it the first listen thinking Craig was a little bit more of an intellectual. Well, still convinced he's more of an intellectual than I had given him credit for.
Okay.
But as, maybe the fourth listen, I realized, there seems to be a little of obscurantism going on here. He seems to be intentionally kind of hiding some things. He is a thinker. He is identifying the main problems for sure. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I agree with the conclusions he's coming to. In fact, that's said a little too passively. I do not agree with the conclusions he's coming to and how he gets there, mm-hmm. but he is thinking and he is in some ways highlighting the main problems. Mm-hmm. It's just that somehow he ducks out. He's very slick. He kind of ducks in a way. And unless you really pin him down, you won't even realize what he's actually saying to you, That's what I found.
One of the things that made Craig's struggle in his book and all that important to me, because I don't agree with his conclusions and how he reconciles things, but he did at least verify for me, okay, so these are problems though, right? Like you wouldn't be going through all this if these were not real problems. And the issue I have is Christians that try to make it seem like these aren't real problems. Like we don't need to pay attention to evolution. We don't need to pay attention to population genetics. At least be honest enough to say, no, these are legitimate issues that we need to find some kind of way to deal with. So if you did that much for me, to me, you did me a great favor. I'm not going to try to solve it the way you're trying to solve it, but I will amen and say, no, that's a problem for my belief. And that was enough of a problem for me to say, okay, so this whole thing can be dismantled now. Thank you. I felt that I sensed this since 2024. You confirmed that I'm on the right track on my way out the door here. Yeah. So with that said, I'll share. We'll let them talk and we'll stop them where we need to. So Enns just talked about his book, The Evolution of Adam, why he wrote it. We're going to come in with Craig talking about his book, The Quest for the Historical Adam, and why he wrote it, and we can stop it where we need to.
I'm in the process of writing a multi-volume systematic philosophical theology, and I knew before I commenced this project that I needed to settle some things in the area of theological anthropology, and in particular, the question of human origins and Adam and Eve. And so I decided that I would do a sort of preliminary study on the question of the historical Adam with a view toward determining just what my biblical commitments are as a Christian.
And that's a term he uses a lot. And that was one of the terms that almost nauseated me as I read his work. What my biblical commitments are. If you're pre-committed to the Bible being right, that's going to affect the way that you see everything else. So even the science, as much as he's trying to pay attention to it and give respect to it, he's got these biblical commitments that science be damned, I'm going to find some kind of way to still hold to these commitments, as opposed to what's the reality that I'm living in, and do those realities rip those biblical commitments from me? If I'm going to be committed to the reality that I'm in, like if I'm going to respect that, I need to be able to say, if reality takes me away from this thing that I'm holding by faith, then so be it. But because I've got biblical commitments, I can't do that. And as I was reading through his book, I could not accept that as an approach.
And then whether or not those commitments are consistent with the contemporary scientific evidence concerning human origins. I don't see a great deal at stake theologically in this discussion. Many people will say that the doctrine of original sin stands or falls with the historicity of Adam and Eve. If there was no historical Adam, then obviously it's impossible that his sins were imputed to every one of his descendants. I agree that if you hold to that doctrine of the imputation of Adam's sin to all of his posterity, then the absence of a historical Adam would be fatal. But I don't find that doctrine taught in the Bible. I don't find it taught in Genesis 3, in the story of the fall, and I don't see it in Romans chapter 5, where Paul discusses the effects of Adam's sin upon humanity. And therefore, it troubles me little to have to give up the notion that Adam's sin is imputed to every human being descended from him. Rather, it seems to me that the most important issue theologically will be your doctrine of inspiration and the deity and infallibility of Jesus Christ.
Pause it there. Did he just say that you don't need a historical Adam? And then he goes on to say, well, actually, it's the larger problem is made by the person of Christ, because he seems to believe this. So now you have issues in terms of his omniscience, for instance. But the problem is, I know I'm going on.
No, hold on, because you're cutting yourself off. I don't want people to miss what you're saying. Craig is saying it's not that you need Adam for the original sin. You need Adam because Jesus seems to believe in a historical Adam. And if Jesus believes in a historical Adam, then Jesus held false views if there is no historical Adam. So Craig's not worried about Romans 5. Craig's worried about Jesus.
But see, now, so hold on. So when I first heard him say no need for the historical Adam, I later came to realize it seemed like he's saying, oh, you don't need him for this particular doctrine because I don't believe that the scriptures teach that doctrine, namely the imputation of Adam's sin to other people. But I wasn't wrong. Upon my fourth listen today, and a careful listen, at about 32 minutes in, Peter seemed to peep the same thing I peeped, and summarizes his position in a way in which he implies that he has come to understand Craig to not see the need for a historical Adam.
You don't have to have Adam and Eve as literal historical figures. You can still work with Christian doctrine and make that work somehow. I feel the same way about the patriarchal stories, and really the
you see that? Do you see that?
He's talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
No. Just go back to that statement again. Go back just a little bit and listen to that one more time, and note that he isn't interjected upon and sort of rebuffed. Like, that statement is let to stand. Listen to what he says.
It's what Bill, you said before. You don't have to have Adam and Eve as literal historical figures. You can still work with Christian doctrine and make that work somehow. I feel the same way about the patriarchal stories.
That's it.
And really the
essential. Either end is not adequately summarizing Craig, or Craig agrees with that, but Craig doesn't come back and clear that up.
Well, I won't say absence, but it's really not till the 9th century. Well, with the Merneptah stealing the 13th century, we have Israel mentioned, which is a very important thing. But history is a tricky thing in the Bible. And it's something that's hard to wrap my head around. And I can't solve all that before I get to these other questions, right? I just have to play with models and hypotheses and theories that I have about how this works. And that's how I see it at this point.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Dr. Craig just as a way of recapping what you said, because you said a lot and it was good. I just want to make sure I'm following. And also I can then pass this to Dr. Craig for comment. It sounds like what you're saying, big picture, is there are these genealogies in Genesis 1 to 11, and there is this linkage in the genealogies between Adam and the patriarchs. But because of the sorts of parallels that you see throughout the Hebrew Bible, you question the historicity of the patriarchs as well. And so this sort of connection between Adam and those patriarchs, if you question the historicity of the patriarchs, it wouldn't show historicity of Adam either. That sounds like...
that's a way of summarizing it. I would just add, too, that the genealogies themselves don't demand...
This conversation actually happened because Craig said that the existence of genealogies in Genesis shows that they were all meant to be taken as literal historical people. And Peter Enns rejected to that point on literary grounds. You could have genealogies that are not literal, they're figurative devices. That's what they're talking about here.
Historical text.
Mm-hmm.
The
and there's some overlap between that. There's some overlap between those ideas and that little kind of parenthetical riff that Mace did on our last video we reviewed, where he was like, if you're going to take this part literally, then you got to take the rest of it literally. It's a similar kind of wooden reading of a text, which you feel demands a certain kind of, it's like, oh, I put the one in there and I put the other number in, and this is what has to happen if we do it. And it's like not really giving, like, in other words, for those who might be losing me here, or I might be losing you, Craig is saying because of the way genealogies function in that world, contextually, the world that these texts were written in, it would necessarily mean that these things were supposed to be considered legitimate history. Yes. And what Enns is saying is that basically even within fiction, a person could employ a thing that generally was used to make, it's almost like to make people suspend their disbelief, you might include elements that look factual, that look historical.
Verisimilitude. It's called verisimilitude. Yeah.
So like in any work of art where they are hoping you to suspend disbelief, they're going to try to make it as believable as possible. And one of the ways you can do it is to employ devices that are typically used in actual historical narratives to a fictive one, or one that's more mythological, appear to be more historical, so that you can get more immersed. The whole point in art, which is what we're talking about here, is the art of literature, is to captivate an audience, to somehow immerse your audience in the world that you're trying to create.
Well, Enns is saying it's the verisimilitude of, I need things in my story that reflect real life so that you can get involved in the story, that you can put yourself in this setting. So you're going to use real names of real places. You know what I mean? You're going to use maybe real battles that happen, because that'll help pull people into this fictitious world. And the thing that Enns is saying is he's doing the reverse of Craig. Craig is saying, well, if the genealogies are real, because you don't put genealogies in unless they're real people. If the genealogies are real and they tie back to Adam, then maybe Adam was meant to be real too. Enns is saying, no, they could both be fiction. The genealogies could be fiction, and so could Adam. And matter of fact, he says, I'm still wrapping my mind around this. Even though Enns is sure that Adam is fiction, he says for him, basically the jury is still out on whether or not the patriarchs are fiction too. I think Enns thinks that they are, but there's certain things that he just can't say because that's such a large chunk of the Christian belief that, come on, you give up on Adam and you give up on the patriarchs too, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob too. Then you're pushing the birth of Israel. That's why they mentioned the Mytho-history. Like, you're trying to figure out, when do these people become historical and not just mythos or mytho-history?
The feeling I got from Enns throughout the whole thing is that he's sort of unbothered by its historicity or lack thereof. It's not, it's almost, you can almost see it in the way they present themselves. Craig has got the collared shirt and sweater on, and just sort of he looks like he's just lounging in his house. There's a certain attitude of, there's a casualness he has when it comes to whether or not, he even makes a statement at some point at 3140, he says essentially his take on whatever he was talking about, he could be completely wrong about, but he was unbothered by it. He was
talking about whether the patriarchs were real people. He could be wrong about that. He thinks they may not have been, but he could be wrong, and that wouldn't really bother him.
He was totally unbothered. This would not lead to a crisis of faith, because clearly his faith is not attached to historicity. It's not attached to almost any kind of, like, you name it within the text. He's found some other place to rest the flag of his faith other than those things.
Once you let Adam go, you sort of end up, this is why people, the creationists and all that, they call it a slippery slope, because once you let go of Adam and Eve, and once you let go of the garden narrative, you do find yourself in this almost like, well, I really don't have to hold on to much. The only thing you can hold on to that point is Jesus. Everything else is for sale. They'll talk about some of this, but one of the things that helped Craig and especially helped Enns and others like him to move on past Adam and Eve is the comparative literature from the ancient Near East. When you see the way that these foundation narratives, these foundation myths, the way that they function in ancient societies, and you see that what Genesis is doing, at least 1 through 11, it's not very different at all. Matter of fact, it's even borrowing some of the same stories to create these foundation myths. So Enns knew early on, I've got to do something else with these stories. Craig later on finds out some of this stuff, but he's just not sure because of his biblical or his theological commitments. He's not sure how much of it he can let go and how much he has to keep. That's the struggle. So we'll let them talk it out, and then we'll pause it where we need to.
The last thing I would say, I said this to you on the phone, Brady, was that this is in stark contrast to the conversation we were dissecting the last time we got together, talking about in the sanctuary, or was it the sanctuary podcast, where they haven't even entered the chat. Like this conversation, the conversation that Enns and Craig are having, in my opinion, it is the conversation, definite article. This is the one that should be being had.
Yeah.
If you're talking about cherubim and seraphim and all that kind of thing, and the details of whether they're shape shifting and this univocal kind of thing, like you haven't even begun to deal with the real problem. This conversation, it hasn't blown up, and I can't wait to see other counter apologists attack this. Like, make no mistake, whether this video has hundreds of thousands of views or not. In my opinion, this is the most important conversation to be had.
Well, I looked at this before we got on, and I was very shocked. This video only went live 6 days ago, and it's only got 9,000 views, which it almost makes me sad, because I'm like, as important as this conversation is, you're right. This is the conversation that Christians, especially evangelicals, need to be having, but it only got 9,000 views so far. It's like it's almost like no one even cares. But this is the most important thing that you could be talking about, is whether or not what Paul says, and they're going to talk about it, so we should get to it.
The Bible teaches that there was a historical Adam, and yet there was not. Then you're going to have to revise your doctrine of inspiration in such a way that either an inspired document can teach falsehoods, or else that only portions of that document, say its theological content, is inspired, but not its historical and scientific content. In either case, it's going to cause some serious reverberation.
I worked through all that in my book in terms of the pros and cons of all these different options of, do we take some of it literally? Do we take some of it historically? Do we take some of it figuratively? I worked through all that in chapters 6 through 9 of Let There Be Gaslight.
I think in your doctrine of inspiration in Scripture, even more serious would be the infallibility and deity of Jesus. If Jesus of Nazareth believed that there was a historical Adam, as I think he did, then if that belief is false, then it's difficult to see how Jesus can be divine, because a property of God is that God is omniscient.
Notice what's happening. Because he's committed to the deity of Jesus, he's got to, and because Jesus believed that Adam was historical, he's got to find some kind of way to justify his belief in a historical Adam, as opposed to the idea of there being a first man and a first woman is nonsensical in light of population genetics. Even when he talks about the science, he's not going to undo that fact. A first man and a first woman as original creations and as the founding couple of all of humanity, it's unthinkable. It's impossible. But because Jesus believed in a historical Adam and Eve, he's got to hold to it. Just think about how that contorts your life, that you have to be beholden to what people thousands of years ago, we don't even know if they believe this stuff as much as they wrote about it for whatever reasons they wrote about it. But now here you are beholden to that in your life with everything that we have going on in 2025 with our modern science and all. Just think about this. This is the most insane way to live your life.
Is to say he knows all truths and believes no falsehoods. But in this case, Jesus would be guilty of believing a falsehood, namely that historical Adam and Eve existed. And so that's going to cause some Christological reverberations. I try to discuss what I call a worst case scenario. Suppose there was no historical Adam and Eve. Can we deal with those reverberations? And I think that
he's being really slick here, but he's basically on inside, and that's why ends later. If you remember the clip I had you play right after him, where ends up saying, "Hey, you're saying we don't need a historical." Ends is getting the dog whistle there because he's even acknowledging it here. What do you mean we can make it work without a historical Adam? But we don't have to do that. It's his way of leaving it open for it's sort of like he knows it's almost like he knows that this historical Adam isn't real, but he's still going with the conservative thing.
If you're a Christian, you got to ask yourself, William Lane Craig says we can make it work without a historical Adam and Eve. Christian, ask yourself, can you? Like, before you go read his book
or
and figure out.
Even if you don't ask yourself, ask Craig. I want to see the model.
No. Let's not do that yet. That's what I was going to say. Before you go read his book and figure out how he does it, you, without the help of theologians, I talk about this in chapter 1 in my book. Without the help of theologians, if you had to make sense of the gospel narrative and all that without a historical Adam and Eve, could you? Because if not, what you're saying is you're dependent upon these people to help shut your imagination to figure out how you're going to do this. When you've got a Bible sitting in front of you at home that's not doing what these men are doing. Paul needs a historical.
No, but I'm making an entirely different point. I'm making an entirely different point. Because after he says that, and 4 minutes in, he goes on to show you run into serious Christological issues because Christ seems to believe he's a historical Adam and he's omniscient.
Yeah.
I'm saying William Lane Craig, since you say that you can do, I said Lane Craig, well, I guess that should be the name, William Lane Craig, right? Since
be kind.
You have proposed, you said here, we can work it out, but you don't think we should. But earlier, after pointing out that he doesn't need to be historical, then you point out he doesn't need to be historical specifically for the imputed sin. Imputed, I should say. And then you go and say, well, the reason isn't the imputed sin. The reason is our Christology, because Christ believed this. But then now you're telling us 6 minutes in, a few minutes later, that we could actually make that model work. I want to know how that model works in his mind. I don't give a fuck. I'm sorry for the curse. I'm just saying how, because he follows it up by saying we run into serious Christological problems if he's not historical. That is Adam. Okay. What is this model that, because he says here, like, I don't want to make you rewind it again, but he says we can do that, but I'd rather we don't. Well, why would you rather we don't? Like, show us the Wizard of Oz. Show us him. Like, where is this magical fix? Because he just never articulate in this whole video. He does not articulate how those two things could be compatible. Whereas Peter Enns gives you a working position. He says his position is none of these characters are historical or whatever. It doesn't matter if they are, And it's, for all intents and purposes, it seems that's the same thing Craig is saying.
Can we deal with those reverberations? And I think that we can successfully do so, but I'd rather not have to if it's not necessary. And so for me, that would be the most important thing, I suppose, that is at stake in this debate.
I agree that those are things that are at stake. I think where we might differ is our level of comfortability with certain kinds of responses. Bill, you mentioned the worst case scenario, which I sort of adopted in my book also, The Evolution of Adam, and I went with it. I extrapolated out from it. And I agree with you. There is a workaround to understanding the nature of humanity. I mean, Judaism does it, right? Judaism doesn't have an original sin that's imputed from Adam, but it's the flood story. The inclination of the human heart was only evil all the time. It's just the way people are.
Think about what he's saying there. He's not saying that in Genesis 6, the inclination of man's heart was only evil all the time. He's not saying that in Genesis, that's a consequence of Adam's sin, because Genesis doesn't make that point. It's only evangelicals who come along later and tie the Genesis 6 statement into some supposed fall in Genesis 3, which that doesn't really happen in the text. So Enns is separating the theology from what the actual text says here.
I'm fairly comfortable with that. I mean, I don't need to be convinced of my own sinfulness. I see it every single day. But I just don't know if, the Adam and Eve story doesn't say that. And I don't think Paul says it either in Romans 5, which would be the only place where he would say it. And so that's, see, this is, to me, this is wonderful. There's so much agreement between us in terms of what the data are, how to understand them, the importance of science in this. We can't push that to the side. We have to, with integrity, have a conversation between our becoming to understand things that were not known in past times, and also the scriptural tradition, which remains the same, but it is open to various interpretations over time, which is...
Let me ask you, Jay Witt, how would you have responded to both Enns and Craig saying Paul is not teaching the traditional understanding that we have of the imputation of Adam's sin in Romans 5? So maybe the non-historical Adam messes with your doctrine of Christ's deity, but it shouldn't mess with your doctrine of sin, because Genesis 3 is not teaching a fall into sin, and Romans 5 is not teaching that Adam's sin is imputed to everyone who comes from him. How would you have responded?
Well, I mean, there are problems I have with the way they mingle fiction with serious, deep truths where you're discussing death and an afterlife and so forth. I honestly, I don't agree with some of the conclusions they draw and how willy-nilly they believe the apostle was being about using non-historical characters in the context of very serious discussions. I think it raises almost as many questions as he may feel like he's answering the question that comes from science when you're trying to present us with the historicity of Adam and Eve. But he then raises questions about why we're holding Paul up as any authority at all. So, I mean, you have to wonder, like, what does it mean to have apostolic authority if you know less about history and you're quoting things that we know are totally fiction, but you think they're real? Then how are you it's like, how is the guy who knows the least about the subject the authority on the matter? You know what I mean? Like, it just, the access we have to Paul right now is through copies of his writings. And so the only importance that he has to us is mainly the thought world that he has created on the page that we've inherited through copies. Now, if you're telling me that his thought world was wrong in huge areas where we could even acknowledge we know he's wrong and he thought the wrong thing, how is this guy then authoritative?
I may be wrong on this and correct me, but I think where we might be diverging is on the question of Christology and on the question of the degree to which we can expect historical information, not just from Genesis, but from other portions of Scripture as well. And I put it that way precisely because of trying to keep in mind ancient context and how people might have thought about things and understood things. So,
what is the genre of Genesis 1 to 11? And do you think that those early chapters teach that Adam and Eve are historical?
Are you asking the genre of 1 to 11 or of the whole?
If I can interject here real fast.
Yeah.
If I can interject here really fast. I remember, I think it was the third time I listened to this, when he got to that point, it was like, this is a really shoddy way to pass on important information to people. Like the idea that
you mean for a God to do this?
Yeah. Thousands of years after the text somehow was put together, we're sitting here and having to contemplate, what am I even reading? Like, it's like, imagine going to a movie and they say, oh, is it a thriller? Is it a romance? You don't even have that. And that's so huge when it comes to knowing, like, say for instance, you're going out on a date with a woman and you're like, all right, she wants to check a romantic comedy. Imagine all of the movies that you're going to see not having any information about the genre of the movie, so that you're based on the titles having to figure out, all right, I'm going to try it. This looks like it might be a romantic comedy based on the title. I see some smiling faces, but having no way to know, no direct access to information that lets you. That's probably not the best analogy.
No, it's pretty good.
it kind of reminds me of that kind of situation. It's like you have guys who, Craig, for instance, is well into his middle age, if not past his middle age. And this is a relevant question for a man who's been poring over this text for decades. Just think about that. It's just,
yes. And he very recently came to an understanding that it wasn't as historical as he once thought. So you went around the world. This is what pissed me off. He went around the world defending the God of the Bible, the resurrection, Jesus, and all this. And he says, in the clip that I played from him earlier, he talked about, he kind of just had this sort of like, who cares about a historical Adam as long as, we get to Jesus. But then he realized how important it was. But like you said, to get to this stage of his life, after having done all that with the Bible in hand, with the Bible out front, and now all of a sudden have to think about, what genre of literature is this? Is this historical? Like it's so late in the game. You've influenced so many people to believe your gospel, and now you're having to go back and second guess and try to figure out how much of it is actually historical. That's infuriating to think that a God would do something like this.
It says a lot that it is even a relevant question. Like certain questions, like if they ask, it's like, did I leave that chicken out on the counter all yesterday after you eat in the middle?
I posted this on Facebook a little while ago. Said, assuming that the God of the Bible is real, how did this God not lie to me? If this God knew that Adam and Eve were not historical, and that I believed the Bible, I only got so far in the Bible, I only got up to Jesus because I started in Genesis and believed that and worked my way up to Jesus. But if this God knew that I would one day find out that, this beginning is not real, then this destroys everything. How did he not lie to me if he knew that had I known that it wasn't historical from the jump, I would have never bought into it? Yet for 30 years, I went around the world thinking that it was, and all the energy, all the creativity, everything that this story produced in me and this religion got out of me. And then you get me into my mid 40s and I realize, oh shit, this isn't true. This isn't historical. If a God really does stand behind it, how did he not lie to me? How did he not mislead me? And so it became a whole discussion on Facebook about whether or not God lied to me, allowed me to be lied to, or whatever. But it's maddening.
And for them to come to you after you point this out and say, well, you were just the wrong kind of Christian. You were a fundamentalist. That was the problem. It's like, if you don't shut the F up and get out of my face, you're calling me a fundy? Like, as though there was something, like, here you have gray-headed, aged men sitting, and they have to have the conversation about, is this history, or is this myth, or what's the genre? How can you be so sure it's not his? I mean, the reason why it's a relevant question is it's not something that's very, well, we should let them talk. They're going to unpack the multiple ways that it makes it difficult to know what genre it is.
Yeah, let's let them go.
Focused on 1 to 11,
Okay.
but it might be worth mentioning to our viewers why scholars tend to single out 1 to 11 as being a particular portion of Genesis that we need to treat differently than the rest.
What he's saying without saying it is most scholars look at Genesis 1 to 11 as not history. They call it primordial history or things like that, but it's not actual history. And so he's trying to not say it here, but Enns is going to get into it.
Oh, I mean, I would say I think there are ways in which we should treat them similarly because they are a book. But I think it's probably because we don't have mythic elements in chapters 12 and following, and that's significant. So we have Genesis 1 to 11.
That's telling right there. That's telling right there, Brady. Him saying you can tell by what he hasn't said. What he says, that's partially because we don't have mythic elements from 11,
Chapter 12,
right? Yeah. What he's implying by saying that is that there are.
We do have mythical elements in chapters 1 through 11. Yeah.
be stronger
Okay.
than that. It doesn't seem to. It does have similarities and parallels with other origin stories, foundation stories of the ancient world. And it's hard to read the biblical story without saying, wait, this is similar? And why? That's been a question for over 200 years now in biblical scholarship. So in terms of the genre, I'm not sure if any label will quite get at the whole thing, but I would say it is, I don't mind the word myth, but it's often misunderstood. So I try to avoid it in certain contexts. But it's figurative language that reflects Israelite realities from a much later time. And I think, like all foundation stories, that at least that I know of, what we're seeing here is the anchoring of later realities in stories that involve the time before time and the gods, or in this case, the deity, God. And I think I would just be satisfied saying it's figurative theological genre, something like that. That's what I would say.
And as figurative theological genre, do you think that those early chapters of Genesis are teaching a historical Adam and Eve, or as theological figurative language, we can't determine that?
I think that...
Notice he didn't give him the option to say, as figurative theological language, they're not historical. He tried to pigeonhole them with these two, that they are historical or we can't determine. Ends is not on some, it's indeterminate. So,
and not to play games here, but a lot of that would turn on how we understand historical. I think the writer of the story of Adam and Eve, I've come to the conclusion that I think he knew what he was doing in terms of writing a story that's full of potential theological impact for people. We have two trees in the middle that have these magical supernatural properties. We have a talking animal. And I can imagine in my own mind an ancient writer saying, I hope nobody takes this as literal history. I'm writing a story here. And the story, it keeps talking to us. It's deep, it's multi-layered. They're all different angles from which one can approach the story with great benefit. The way, Jordan, I'm trying to get at your question and answer it succinctly, but it's hard. I would say that, is it history or not? I can understand the appeal of phrasing it that way, but I think that's a far less interesting question than what is the writer trying to say? And are we going to let him have his way? Or are we going to impose on him categories?
See, this was the kind of shit
with
that frustrated me and made me say, yeah, something's wrong here. Because anytime you have to go through all of this just to answer a question of whether or not they were historical, what was the writer trying to do? Let's let the writer have his way. Well, how do we know what the writer was trying to do? You got Jesus saying that they were historical. You got Paul saying that the reason why we're in this mess is because of them. And now you're saying we need to let the writer of Genesis have his way? Well, what way is that? And who gets to say? Who's the arbiter?
I think it's disingenuous to even say, I think it's very disingenuous to say the writer of Genesis, like it's just a singular person.
Yeah.
But
That's disingenuous. Like, what do you mean?
The intention of the author and what the audience would have heard.
Okay, before I turn to Dr. Craig, let me say one more thing to perhaps, I'm not trying to box you in.
I'm not trying to get out of the box.
You kind of are.
Right.
You can, cheers.
But do you think that the author of those early chapters of Genesis has in mind a flesh and blood couple that he has retold?
He really is trying to put him in a box that Peter Enns is not trying to be put into. So anytime you start talking about, do you think the author really had a flesh and blood couple? Did they poop? Is there Adam and Eve poop in the ground somewhere? And then he's trying to make this question real so that Enns cannot wriggle out of it. And I think William Lane Craig is enjoying this because he's trying to figure out, like, what are we going to say here? Like, if you're on one end of the bookshelf and I'm on the other end, however far you go is going to determine what the middle ground is. So you can't be way over here and I'm right here. We need you to come a little further in to make this middle ground a little more fundamentalist or a little more at least orthodox. But if you're going to be way out here with where you are, then there's a lot of ground to cover in between here. So
the author of those early chapters of Genesis has in mind a flesh and blood couple that he has retold the story, reshaped the story in various ways to communicate many deep truths that, were he to just report a bare bone report of what the couple did, might have very little significance for us. Yeah. But nonetheless, he's got a flesh and blood couple in mind
And I
Or
appreciate
do
the
you
way you
think-
phrased the question. Yeah, I have to say, I guess so, but I need to be really compelled that's the case. And I'm not sure if that's going to happen at this stage of my
So
life.
why do you guess so? Like, if I guess the author had a flesh and blood couple in mind, and if you're not convinced that that's the case, why do you guess so? And to me, it seems like he's trying to play safe. He's trying to stay close enough to the base to not get tagged out.
I just think he just isn't he seems very uninterested in that particular conversation personally. As I've watched this, he doesn't seem interested in those.
Right.
He's not the kind of evangelical William Lane Craig is. He's a much more liberal person.
So he's saying he doesn't have
he
doesn't have a dog in that fight. He's not really, it doesn't matter one way or another to him. So he can get that ground away by saying I guess so and lose nothing.
He's not as clear in his speech. He's like using things like I guess and stuff. You're not hearing that kind of thing from William Lane Craig. He's much more uptight, even in posture. So just the way they're visually presenting themselves. The guy has a white ironed up collar shirt with the sweater. He's just sitting around in the sweatshirt and he doesn't have a bunch of books behind him and so forth. His sentence structure is looser. He's not as uptight about this stuff. He's a liberal. He's just like, all right, I'm good. Like, I don't really need, that's the vibe I'm getting from Enns. And when you read his book, the Sin of Certainty, you get the sense that that's the kind of Christianity that he wants no parts of.
Yeah.
That kind of certain, you understand. I don't need to elaborate more.
I guess so.
I just feel like he's
But I
unbothered.
need to be really compelled that's the case. And I'm not sure if that's going to happen at this stage in my life. I'm always open to having a difference of opinion.
I want to bring in Dr. Craig for his view, and hopefully there could be an exchange on this point. So, Dr. Craig, what genre do you consider Genesis 1 to 11? And do you think that section of scripture teaches that there was this flesh and blood couple, even if it's recast the story in very figurative ways?
Yes. For me, the determination of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 was the breakthrough insight in this study of the historical Adam. And here I would argue with Peter that on the basis of family resemblances of myths, that you can show, I think, very plausibly that Genesis 1 to 11 are mythical. And I am not averse to using that word. I am forthright about it because I make it clear that I'm not using the word myth in the popular sense that people talk about the myth of the self-made man or the myth of the noble savage or things of that sort. Rather, we're using the word myth here in the way that the folklorist or classicist uses myth. Folklorists distinguish between myths, legends, and folk tales. And myths are characterized primarily as sacred narratives that are handed down in a culture for which that narrative is authoritative and which seeks to ground the values and institutions of the author and his society in events deep in the primordial past, what Peter called foundation stories. And when you look at Genesis 1 to 11, it is brimming with these family resemblances to myths. However, I am also persuaded that's not the full story. I think that the Pentateuchal author really did believe that these were
Pentateuchal author, singular, not plural. Just notice that.
real historical persons, that they really were the full story. I think that the Pentateuchal author really did believe that these were real historical persons, that they really were the progenitors of the entire human race, and that this for him is important. The primeval history provides a universal foundation for God's subsequent call of Abraham and his promise to bless the entire world through Abraham and through Israel. And it seems to me that the genealogy,
Even that whole idea, that whole idea just sounds so freaking myopic now. Having left Christianity, yes, he's going to bless the whole earth through this one small people. It's just so extraordinarily culturally ethnocentric. It's just ridiculous. I can't overstate how myopic that statement seems to me now.
So I think there is indication in the narratives themselves that these are not pure myths, but that they have a historical interest. And it was the great Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen who denominated this kind of literature as mytho-history. I first heard that term used by Bill Arnold, Old Testament professor at Asbury, and as he explained it, it just turned on the light for me. And I think that Jacobson was right in saying that we have here myth combined with a genuine interest in history. And for me, that conclusion is strongly confirmed by the New Testament treatment.
What I don't understand is how could you mytho-history? It's myth with a genuine interest in history. But how are you separating one from the other? What is your litmus test? Where's the legend that helps you decide this portion here is myth, this portion here is history? I read Bill T. Arnold on this subject. When I was in Bible college, there's a Bill T. Arnold, he wrote the textbook, the Old Testament textbook that most people read in Bible college. But that was in late 90s, early 2000s. But then in 2008, 2009, he wrote a commentary on Genesis where he switched his view because Bill T. Arnold had learned about this ancient Near Eastern literature and realized how comparative it was to Genesis. And he said, man, I can't look at this as pure history anymore. Bill T. Arnold began to call it mytho-history. And I'm like, well, damn, 10, 12 years ago when I was in Bible college, I read your textbook. You wasn't calling it mytho-history then. So you're another one that had me jumping out the window talking about, oh, this is real, this is history, because of all the stuff you said in your commentary then that's different from the commentary you wrote in 2009. When you learn more about how the ancient world worked and how their writings worked, now you're willing to call it something else. But still, calling it mytho-history, how does that then sanctify it as trustworthy history? How are you deciding what you're going to take as myth, what you're going to take as history? And even the stuff you take as myth, what the hell does that mean when you're combining it with history? What's the point of giving it that designation if you're going to still turn around and treat the myth like history?
Well, that's what I was going to point out is if you're claiming that myth is not myth in the colloquial sense that we use it, then is it even need? Do we need an apostrophe or whatever?
Right.
Or do we need, why not just call it history? Like, I mean,
Right.
why do we need myth in that? Like, it doesn't seem, it's not efficient. Like, I mean, like if what you're trying to say is history, then just say it's history.
Yeah.
Say it's just history with a twist. Like it doesn't have to be factual the way we think, because that seems to be what he's trying to say. What he's trying to say is that it's true in certain ways, and these people. What does it mean that Christ thought these people were historical if it didn't have to be historical in the way a contemporary person thinks of historical? What does that even mean?
Yeah. So
I don't think by saying mytho-history and attaching the words like that, you're doing, I don't know, maybe he's just trying to say we need to reevaluate the way we think about myths and take on his understanding of that.
He's also saying, without saying it, we need to reevaluate the way we think about history because it's mytho-history. Yeah. It's like once you put the terms together, which is the controlling factor, myth or history? And what do you mean by myth? If you don't, it's like you want myth to mean history, but you need your history to be attached to myth so that when science disproves part of it, you can say, oh, well, it's not pure history, it's mytho-history. So you're sort of trying to have your cake and eat it too. I talk about this in chapter 6 or chapter 7 of Let There Be Gaslight. These guys are trying to have their cake and eat it too. We want it to be treated like history, but we also want the back door being able to say, but I called it myth in case we find out that it can't be true.
It's like the old McGriddle sandwich where they try to give you your pancakes as a breakfast sandwich. It's like it's not a good sandwich or a good pancake. It's like just give me the history or give me myth, man. Don't give me the McGriddle.
You know what's funny?
Basically giving me two pancakes.
I never really could get to the point where I could decide whether or not I liked the McGriddle. Because there was something I liked about it that it reminded me of the pancake because you got the syrup that's sort of in the pancake already, so it was sweet. But then when the sausage and all that, it's like, wait, I don't, when I eat my pancakes and sausage and eggs, I don't put them all on the fork at the same time. So I could never decide if I liked the McGriddle. And it's the same thing with this mytho-history. It's like, I can't decide whether I like this. Like, is it myth or is it history? Make up your mind.
Yeah, just give me mine separate. Like, if you want to give me myth, give me that on the side, man. Give me my myth on the side, like my sausages. I don't want you to take it and make a sandwich out of it, man. Like,
But
no,
they need to cobble them together so that they could, just in case, I could always say, but I said it was myth, so you can't say I'm lying when it can't be history anymore.
One thing I'm realizing through this discussion is I don't know how any Christian could get mad at a person for being like, all right, I'm done. I'm walking away from this table. Like, even if, like, just Christian, if you're in the audience and you're like, oh, these scoffers or whatever, just at least bear with us here and understand, like, if this is the level of conversation we have to get in to buy into this, you can't be mad at somebody. Like, if they come there and they're just like, I'm just coming here to get pancakes, man. And then all you have to serve up is the McGriddle. If the person walks out, you can't be mad at them.
Right.
You really can't.
Right. Yeah.
You can't be mad at them because it's like, yo, this is not what I'm signing up for.
Yep. Indeed.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. There we go.